Hi, everyone. My name is Joanna Redden. I'm a member of the Responsible AI program team. On behalf of the team, it is my sincere pleasure to welcome Professor Ekaterina Hertog. Professor Hertog comes to us from the Oxford Internet Institute, where she leads the ESRC-funded Domestic AI project, a project that scopes new technologies' potential to free up time now locked into domestic labor, and also measures how willing people are to introduce these technologies into their private lives. Professor Hertog, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to hearing more about your research, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming here. I hope you can see and hear me well, and you can see my screen. So I'm very excited, and this is very much work in progress. So I'm looking forward to your comments, feedback, challenges on this work. So without very much further ado, as Joanna said, I'm based at the Oxford Internet Institute, but I'm also shared with the Institute for Ethics and AI at Oxford University. And my current research project is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. Today's paper is done in collaboration with Professor Leah Rupannar and Brenda Churchill, both based at Australian National University. And we wanted to know, we were trying to answer a question of who wants a smart wife, and looking at gender, educational and occupational differences in willingness to use technology for domestic work across Europe. Okay. So before I start on technology, I just wanted to say a few words on domestic work. And many of us have seen, both in the media, in policy research and academic research, there's a lot of work being done on paid work automation. What will happen? There's a lot of concern with paid work, and domestic work often gets ignored in that context. However, domestic work is critical to health and well-being. Societies basically cannot, and I think this image I have, which is on my right and perhaps on your left, societies can't function if no one's cooking meals, no one's caring or raising children, caring for dependent adults and cleaning houses and so on. Life just can't go on without domestic work. Moreover, not only it's very important, it's also really time consuming. So it's not something we can do sort of in a couple of minutes in a day and forget about it. If we look at general time use surveys, which is the most common and the most the measure most used for domestic work, then we can see that in terms of time spent, domestic work takes somewhat less time than paid work on average across working age population, but not that much less. We're speaking about hours a day. Also, it's shared very unequally across within households, with women everywhere in the world, including even the Nordic countries that are often held up as the sort of most egalitarian of all. Women do more of it, and this has consequences. Again, at least in sociology, caregiver penalty is a sort of common theme, and this refers to the loss of income, long-term income, career progression, and other negative labor market consequences that people who have significant care responsibilities experience, who assume significant care responsibilities. And quite often it's referred to as motherhood penalty, because again, women and especially mothers are affected more by this than men, for example. So digital technologies and AI, sometimes I think there's not a very clear big agreement on AI. I use the term loosely, broadly thinking about technologies that use machine learning techniques. I mean, many digital technologies will have some kind of aspect of that going on in the background. And they seem to be holding some promise to address sorry, that's a typo, to address these issues and to help us with caring for the elderly, delivering our goods, and smart homes looking after our well-being. These, of course, are all images that have kind of seem to look towards the future, but actually these technologies are emerging. These technologies are already coming into our homes. This is an image I created based on the annual reports published by the International Federation of Robotics from between 2010 and 2019. International Federation of Robotics, so it publishes this very general kind of annual figures, and it categorizes robots in a very broad, it's their definitions, very broad 4 categories. And the first one is household service robots. This is the kind of robots I'm interested in. And they are, as they say themselves, currently, this mostly refers to robotic vacuum cleaners, floor mops, and lawnmowers. Then we have household entertainment robots, professional service robots. Here you could think about various robotic technologies used in elder care homes, for example, or in hospitals to sanitize spaces and so on. And finally, industrial robots. This could be anything used in factories. All of these robots are counted in units sold, with the exception of industrial robots, which are counted in units installed. And as you can see, if we just look at least the number of these units, rather than perhaps on the value, if we look at how much they cost, that would probably be a very different figure. But if we look at the numbers of these robots that are being sold and coming into, in case of household service robots, probably coming into private homes, then these robots outnumbered all kinds of other robotic units from as early as 2010. Moreover, in more recent years, there's this huge upturn in the rise of household service robots from 2017 that's going essentially exponentially and much faster than any other robots based on these reports. A small caveat, this, if we think about domestic automation, these reports only look on this International Federation of Robotics only counts robots specifically, whereas of course, a lot of domestic automation can happen with the help of apps. We can think about grocery shopping, or perhaps some educational apps to help children with homework and so on. So this would be an undercount if we think in terms of smart technologies used. This is to give another sort of snapshot to it. This comes from specifically an expert survey carried out by my domestic AI project at Oxford University. In 2021, we've asked people whom we broadly defined as AI experts working on technologies that could be relevant for domestic automation, like educational technologies, or could be large language models, as that's relevant for human interaction and so on. So we've presented them with a list of 17 domestic tasks, and you could see this on the left. The types of tasks that we looked at, and asked them, well, what do you think? How much of time that people are currently spending on these tasks could be reduced through automation in 10 years' time? And I think there are 2 maybe key takeaways from this figure. And first of all, that there's significant chunk, experts think that there would be significant amount of time could be saved. They don't know whether this will actually come into the market, this will be legally possible. This is a forecasting exercise, but technically they expect that quite large amounts of time, if you average across all these tasks, the number is 39% of time could be saved through domestic automation. And the second takeaway is that routine domestic tasks, such as cooking, that essentially has to happen every day, dishwashing, cleaning, grocery shopping, something that's quite repetitive and can be routinized, has greater potential for automation compared to more interactive tasks, especially care tasks, which are more sort of pinker bars on your right. So some of this automation is already the reality. In the short-term future, experts expect a lot more of it. We've asked them to take the current point in time as the baseline, so they're starting from the point that where we are now, where we already have washing machines and dishwashers and Roomba vacuum cleaners, not to imagine a household where there's no technology and no automation or support of domestic labor at all. So, in spite of the fact that this is happening, and experts predict that this will happen even more at quite a large extent in the near future, there's been little attention paid to it on academic side or by policymakers. Yet, this is understanding more about domestic work automation is important because, first of all, they have the potential of significantly transforming the domestic sphere. For example, I think on average for working age people, we would spend something like perhaps 4 hours a day on various types of domestic work. If 40% of that time is freed up for adoption of various fancy, interesting cooking robots and cleaning robots and so on, that time can be spent on something else. If there is no inequality and it's just adopted, anyone who wants to adopt such a robot can adopt such a robot, then women would stand to disproportionately benefit as well. So we could see a reduction in gender inequalities, for example. So there could be a variety of social consequences. Freed up time could be spent in new and different ways. There are also associated risks. For example, early adopters could at the moment, as I said, there is not so much attention paid by policymakers or regulators, limited attention by academics. We haven't thought perhaps enough in what bringing these smart technologies into our homes would mean. There is a potential for large increase of surveillance of all household members. Home are generally conceived as private spheres. We have minors there, we have older people there. People don't expect to have to give informed consent to anything when they come into their homes. They think that they're in a private space and don't have to think about robots or cameras watching them. So there's a potential for privacy infringement and associated risks, particularly for the early adopters. So in this paper, we thought, well, we'll see what we know, who wants these domestic robots, who's going to jump at them in particular, who needs them if they come into the market. And we specifically used the cases of receiving shopping or help with shopping and elderly care. This was guided not so much by theoretical, because we think these are the two most important domestic tasks, but by the data available to us. And if you've heard of or know of better sources, more interesting sources of data, we're very open and would be very keen to know more about it. We had a couple of, before starting the analysis, we had a couple of ideas of who would want the domestic robots in particular, who would be keen. First of all, we thought that individual characteristics will play a big role and would be very important. Again, differently from paid work automation, where maybe we need a sort of company boss or to agree before robots could be purchased or the industrial process could be transformed. Domestic sphere or these domestic decisions could be made by households or even by specific individuals, could sort of argue for that and just go on and buy those robots for themselves. So we thought individual characteristics will matter, and it would be potentially it would reflect the need for robotic help. And as we know, women do more unpaid domestic work than men. So we expected that women, especially women in better paid occupations and women who are perhaps busier with their careers and have more demands on their time, would be particularly interested in having some kind of technological help in their homes. Flipping that could be one explanation, but alternatively, maybe there could be, it's not about the need or who needs the robots, but rather who is comfortable enough with them. This is quite a transformation, rather than having this domestic work done by humans, by family members, perhaps sometimes by paid human help, having a technology to do it. And we thought maybe it's actually not about who needs these technologies, but who is comfortable, who is open to robots and to automation, who is going to be also more open to specifically bringing robots to help with shopping and care work. And as we know from past research, men tend to be generally more supportive of all kinds of technologies and feel that they're more skilled with these technologies. And sometimes because these technologies are more marketed towards men. We know that educated people tend to be more comfortable with using technology overall. So again, they might be more open to using domestic technologies. And finally, perhaps it's just a practical experience. Perhaps it's those who already use a robot in different setting, at work, for example, who would also then want to see how helpful, how useful it could be, helping at with paid labor, and want to bring this to their homes. In addition, so we were interested, we thought, individual factors matter, but perhaps it's also the macro level factors, and it's the broader country level context that might also make a difference. And so we wanted to see whether the variation in individual attitudes vary also by where the people live. And here again, at the macro level, we thought whether need and how exposed people may be to technologies will influence the attitudes that they express. And in terms of need, perhaps in societies or in communities where women have higher levels of employment, people will be more open to domestic technologies, both men and women. And this might reflect that, again, as we said, women disproportionately do domestic work. And if women are already busy in the paid labor market, they might be less available. So there's a labor shortage in a sense that people could look to technologies to address that issue. Specifically with elder care, we didn't find or couldn't think of a sort of comparable measure for shopping, but for elder care, there could be ways of measuring how much elder care is available already, usually through human labor. So we were thinking that perhaps in countries which are more generous and provide more support for old age through cash benefits, through availability of sort of social workers and doctors, specifically aimed to support older people, would be less open to technologies or to robots that could help with elder care, because there's already quite generous provision there, and there is less of a problem that people are looking for a solution for. Finally, thinking about affinity, we imagined that perhaps richer countries and people in richer countries are more exposed to technology through seeing their work, seeing it sort of in the shops, at their neighbors or friends or family members. And again, being more exposed to to domestic robots or to robots in some contexts would also make people more open to them. So these were our hypotheses based broadly on need and affinity technology. To answer those questions, we used the Special Eurobarometer survey from 2017. The choice of the survey was sort of the best source that we found, which had quite a lot of different countries. It has 28 European countries, 27 EU countries plus the UK, and moreover, these countries are divided in 178 local regions, and we could link to regional characteristics as a result. We decided to limit our analytical sample to adults, working age adults, so adults aged 20 to 59 years of age. And the reason for that was that we thought that people who these are the people who probably most tend to be more time poor than other parts of our population, different age groups, and they're particularly experiencing the pressure from trying to balance paid and unpaid work, and will be maybe looking for a solution for those pressures. The total sample is about 14,000 adults. The dependent variables were just determined by the questions, the useful questions we found in the survey, and specifically they had questions about attitudes to using robots for elder care and for shopping deliveries. And for methodology, analytical method, we used random intercept, random slope, multi-level ordered logic models. So to show you these are our individual characteristics that we could control for within our models. And I'm happy to discuss those in detail, but broadly speaking, we had gender, education, occupation, age controls, whether people were partnered or single, whether they had children, whether they lived in urban or rural areas, whether they had difficulty paying bills recently. This was used as a poverty measure. And finally, if they've ever used a robot at work or they haven't had that experience. A caveat here, Eurobarometer is quite a good survey in terms of being able to have a fairly large sample and data from quite a large number of countries, but it's one problem, it's rather poor on demographics. So we would have loved to have measures of income, for example, household or individual income levels, but this is just not something that was available to us in this survey. Turning to local level indicators, we've picked up the following three to match our hypothesis. First of all, there's a measure of how generous a country was for old age support. And we decided in the end to use the percent of GDP spent on old age locally. But we tried, there's a variety of other measures as well, so the number of doctors per 10,000 of population and so on. We explored about 7 different measures for there. And in the analysis, the results, I can talk more about it, but basically the results point in the same direction, and they suggest that they all roughly have the similar sort of mechanism in the background. This is the only local level measure that we have only at the country level. So we have 28 countries in the sample, 28 numbers representing percent of GDP used on old age locally. We've also controlled for local GDP per capita measured in euros and adjusted for purchasing power in a given country, and percent of women in local employment. And both of these measures were available to us at the regional level. So we had 178 different regions in the sample. As you can see, there is substantial variation as well across, even though our sample is limited to European countries, which they're less varied. That if we look, we're able to find a survey that measured these things globally, but even just within Europe, there's a significant amount of variation on all these 3 measures. So here is just the first descriptives for you to see on both our dependent variables. These are the answers people gave to questions. How comfortable are you to be taken care of by a robot when you're old? And then how comfortable are you to receive the deliveries with a robot or a drone to your home? And I put these 2 side by side to show that they're not really very strongly correlated. And we can see that in not all the countries that are particularly open to robotic elder care are also, they're not exactly the same countries that are sort of at the top with being particularly open to receiving shopping with a robot. Oh, the way this graph is constructed, 0 is the European average. So the EU, the average across for these attitudes across all the 28 countries. I don't have a good explanation to it, but interestingly, in Eastern Europe, people seem to be, broadly speaking, rather open to the idea of robotic elder care. And in Southern Europe, not only, but a couple of Southern European countries seem to be where there's countries where people are more skeptical. If we think in terms of shopping, I think Nordic countries and some of the Baltics come as more open to this idea. So the attitudes differ, and people don't treat these 2 as the same. It's not that it's just a broad attitude, open to technology, not open to technology. People make a difference between the tasks when they think about these things. So these are the basic exploratory results where we looked at our regional variables, and we wanted to see if we just do basic scatter plots where we take averages in those attitudes by countries and compare them with our local measures. So the first one is the local GDP, and I showed these to you for the attitudes to being cared for in old age by robots, but I have the same ones for the shopping as well in principle. So with GDP, at least in this basic descriptives, nothing much seems to be going on. If we look at percent of women in employment, and if you remember, when we're thinking about local level characteristics, we were thinking that perhaps if more women are working, there will be a labor shortage at home. There will be less female labor, which is typically, this is the labor that does more care work and housework available. And at least this basic descriptive would be consistent with this interpretation. And similarly, although perhaps a bit less pronounced, again, this is just a basic scatter plot. There's no controls there or anything. These are just averages. But we again see a somewhat, less pronounced, but some of a relationship in terms of percent of GDP spent on old age. In more generous countries, people are less interested in robots. Well, and here is the multi-level model that I promised. This is a model which puts all the controls in and tries to see, well, once we add the controls and control for individual characteristics. Is there still an association for local level characteristics? Do individual which matters more, and so on. First takeaway here, individual level characteristics matter quite a lot, differently from what we expected. We thought that women would be more interested in domestic automation, because this is the job, the work that they do more. This is the work that can come at a cost for, I mean, anyone who engages, that spends time on it, can come at a cost, bring this caregiver penalty, lower income, perhaps more interrupted career, and so on. This hasn't been the case. Men, so the need-based individual level explanation is not supported. We rather affinity. So men are more interested in robots to be helping with elderly care. Again, in spite of our expectations, we've also seen that more educated people are more interested. As you can see, that education is measured in years of schooling. This is a limitation of the survey. I would have liked to be able to control for university education and so on. I'm happy to take questions across the board. I don't know. I see there's one hand raised.
Yeah, if you're comfortable, maybe we can go ahead, Radu.
Hi, thank you.
Sorry, the only issue is recording, if you're not worried about that, because I know that sometimes you get recorded if you ask in the middle of the
that's
talk.
fine. That's fine with me.
Good.
Yeah, that's just a quick question. So this survey about the willingness to be cared by a robot, who was the population that they asked from? Is it like the middle-aged people that they're gonna be soon an old age, or it was a current elderly people that they asked from?
No, we looked, it was asked across the board for the survey, so it includes adults from 20 until I think about probably 80 or so. We limited the sample to working age population only, so it's 20 to 59 in this particular analysis.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. That was a great question. More educated people are more comfortable. People, in particular, people in white collar or professional managerial occupations are more keen to be able to use a robot, to be cared for by a robot in old age. People who have experience using a robot at work are more open and more comfortable. When we control for all these individual level characteristics, the effects of the local level characteristics, and particularly in this case, they don't go away. They're still here. They look somewhat smaller. One of the problems is the fairly noisy measures, but they're still visible. And again, in societies that where the larger percent of GDP is spent on old age support, we see less willingness to be cared for by robots in old age. And this is a correlational analysis, so we can't speak about causation. But the hypothesis here would be that this is because people are more comfortable with what's already there. They don't need new digital fancy technologies, and they're less interested in exploring that possibility. In places where more women are in employment, we see more openness to being cared for by robots in old age. And just to say, for this is a model I limited just for to the variables that I was particularly interested in showing to you. That's education, occupation, gender. But this is the full model. It's the identical model with all the other controls. So if you have questions about it, I'm happy to show and discuss that. It's just harder to look at because it becomes so busy and so crunched. I was also wondering whether these attitudes are different for men and women, and whether if I run models separately, for example, whether education will give a particular boost to women's attitudes, but not to men's, and so on. And this wasn't supported by my hypothesis. So this hunch was not supported. Here, men are in blue and women are in red. And while the coefficients, so the dots on these sort of lines represent the coefficients, they often seem larger for men than for women. but not always. But if we look at confidence intervals, they overlap throughout. So we can't really, there is no significant difference between men and women that we could speak confidently about. The smallest overlap is perhaps in the having used robot at work, and maybe if we purely looked at the coefficients, then the difference between male and female coefficients is the largest there. So women who've had experience using a robot at work seem to be experiencing a boost in being comfortable with using a robot at home. But again, we still see the tails of the confidence interval overlap nonetheless. So yeah, there's not much of a strong case to be made here. So what about receiving deliveries with a robot or a drone? And I think these are two quite nice contrast cases, because you can imagine, I mean, being cared for a robot is much taller order, like having a robot provide the care, being there, I don't know, in my when I'm frail and old, and perhaps replacing some human care. It's quite different from just receiving a delivery. However, on the individual level, we see a broadly similar individual characteristics playing out. Again, men are more comfortable, more educated people are more comfortable with these sorts of, with using robots and drones for their deliveries. People in white collar occupations are more open to it, and people who've used robots at work and have experience in sort of in the workplace. And local level indicators, the one sort of thing that I really took heart in is that we don't see any effect of the percent of GDP spent on old age in these models, and that's what we would expect. It would be very strange to see that if the GDP spent on old age matters in the way people think about receiving the shopping deliveries, and I'd be very worried about my models and my effects and whether they're capturing something else. But we don't see that, and local level GDP has a small effect suddenly. And percent of women in employment has the same direction, roughly similar size of an effect as we saw with the elder care. I have another question. If you're happy, as I said, just flag up that this is being recorded.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, this is a very interesting survey result. And I have a specific question about agricultural worker, because this looks like a very it's like a very different result from the rest of occupation people. So I wonder if they have that such a negative perception about robot, like for taking care of them or even receive delivery. Is it because, like, I'm just assuming, right? Because agricultural worker, they work with a lot of different machine tractors a lot. Is that because the definition, their perception of a robot is different from other people? I'm just curious.
Thanks. That's a very interesting question. I would actually also say that it's very noisy. So I think it's also the way who is an agricultural worker. And again, just to, this is 28 European countries, which could include some countries where farms are more automated, and there's a lot of technology, not just tractors, but I think there's more technology evolving to help with farm work. And then we go from sort of quite rich Nordic countries, but all the way to Romania is part of the sample as well. So I think what an agricultural worker is and which kind of work they're doing and how much technology they use in their daily work is very different for agricultural workers across. They seem, so the result is particularly noisy. The confidence interval is very large, which just suggests that they answer all over the place, that some of them are quite positive about technology and some are quite negative as well. So I think that perhaps a variation of what an agricultural worker is and what is the nature of agricultural job perhaps varies particularly much in the survey.
Thank you.
But thanks for the question. That was an interesting point. And again, I've done, these are men and women, and I've put here all the variables that I had in the model. But again, similarly to what we've seen for older elder care, we don't see the confidence intervals overlap throughout. So there is no particular story of men being significantly and reliably different from women how their attitudes to these technologies are patterned. So, well, to conclude, demographic characteristics matter, and gender, education, actually occupation, seem to have particularly large effects. If we think about individual characteristics, local characteristics also play a role. And I think it would be, going forward, it would be interesting to get measures, more local measures that are more directly sort of relevant in the way we had this measure for GDP, percent of GDP spent on elder care support, but for other types of domestic work, where that could help us to understand how this domestic work, what's already available in the country that we're looking at in the local context, what does that entail? It would be nice so better measures are needed. And I want to sort of finish this on highlighting that it would be really useful and important, and I hope this talk was sort of marginally convincing, in that it's important to do more research in the future on this topic. As I've argued, unpaid work and showed unpaid work is automatable, especially housework. Automation of unpaid work could potentially increase everyone's discretionary time. So potentially it could have really positive social consequences, with people having to spend less time on what we could think about as domestic drudgery, so less time on washing the dishes or cleaning the floors, and more time perhaps on playing with the children, or on developing their human capital, getting education, or even paid work and securing high incomes and less interrupted careers. But it could also have much darker consequences. And now, as we're observing the sort of rapid rise of adoption of available domestic robots, as well as we see these expert predictions where they think that the technologies are emerging, and the emerging technologies will make it possible to automate more and more parts of domestic tasks, we could think about this. We need to think about this possible darker consequences and how we maybe want to address them. And this could be encompass access inequality. We are talking in this paper, I was talking about like who wants domestic robots, but the question is also who are they going to be available to? We already have big differences in the time spent on domestic work between rich and poorer households, with richer households being able to outsource some of their cleaning work, perhaps to poorer, usually female workers, or being able to go out to the restaurants and so on. Having robots replace some of the domestic work could change domestic interactions. So perhaps it matters. I mean, I think this is something we need to think about, and perhaps should be thought more about also by ethicists and philosophers. But as a sociologist, thinking about the realities of this work, I think maybe it doesn't really matter if I don't vacuum my own floor, but it's a robot doing it. It doesn't actually change how I relate to my children or to my husband. But if I suddenly get this beautiful, fantastically skilled nanny robot who can take care of my children and follow them and help them with homework and everything, and replace me completely, or replace me 50% of the time, what would that mean for a domestic interaction, of what the family means, of the relationship I'll have with my children, and also who is going to benefit? And maybe I benefit if a robot takes over my care responsibilities, but do the people, the humans or my family members that I would care normally at the moment I care for myself, benefit as well? I mean, and whose sort of interests should we think about first and be worried about first? Homes, as I again said earlier already, are conceived of and usually thought of as very private spheres. So whereas bringing robots to work, has its own potential problems, and there's a lot of literature on that, but people don't expect, work is not a private space. When I'm in the office, I know that I might be seen by others, I might be seen by strangers, and I react and sort of behave perhaps accordingly. Homes were not like that. People still think of them as very private spheres. And even as we're bringing in robots, there have been recent scandals about Roomba vacuum cleaner taking photos and some inappropriate photos within people's homes. And these photos were possible because there was this technology, and perhaps people didn't think that this is what it's going to do, but it can do it. And there's the rise of specter. Some researchers started referring to as carevalence, that is kind of at some point bridges on surveillance, at which point the sort of very positive, very caring and act of care can turn into the act of surveillance, and the potential negative. There are some scholars already doing work on the Internet of Things, and how some domestic technologies, some smart technologies can be used in abusive circumstances to sort of follow intimate partners and so on. So these are all the questions that I think is important for us to think, and would be an important agenda for future research, and particularly important concerns for ethicists, philosophers, and empirical scholars as well. Thank you very much.